So I'm taking questions primarily on the episodes that we've covered so far. And the first question that's come up is about the death of Jesus as it relates to the resurrection, meaning a resurrection couldn't have happened if Jesus didn't actually die in the first place. So how can we be sure that Jesus actually died? It's a good question, so let's talk about it. So the first thing to remember anytime we're addressing questions like this is to think about not merely what is possible, but what is most reasonable. So what is most reasonable when it comes to the death of Jesus? And for that, we really have to go back to the historical record. What does history say? When we go back to shortly after any event took place in history, what documents exist? What evidence is there? And the crucifixion of Jesus is actually confirmed by multiple independent historical sources not long after it actually happened. Of course, we have the 4 gospel accounts, and I'm not going to go into all the detail about this, but all 4 of the gospel accounts that are now later included in the Bible, that is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all 4 attest to the crucifixion of Jesus. There are also additional letters written by Saul of Tarsus, who was a converted enemy of Jesus. He's also known as Paul. Paul also testifies to the crucifixion of Jesus. But then there are even more documents that exist outside of the Bible that contribute to the historical record. We've talked about one before, which is the Roman historian Tacitus. There is also the Jewish historian Josephus. There is a Greek satirist named Lucian of Samosata who actually pokes fun at Christians for what they believe, knowing that the person that they believed in was crucified, and even the Jewish Talmud. So again, I'm not going to go through all of these. I'll put them on the screen so you can look them up yourself later. But the point is that there are multiple independent sources about Jesus, that his crucifixion, that were written not long after this event actually happened. I think, though, the real question as it relates to the crucifixion is, well, couldn't have Jesus faked his own death, right? Couldn't he have lost consciousness and been taken down and presumed to be dead, and then later regained consciousness and presented himself as this resurrected king? Is it possible? Yeah, of course. Many things are possible. Is it reasonable? So as we're thinking about, is it reasonable? Here's a few things to think about. Crucifixion is an execution by Roman soldiers, and it was their profession to do so. And if they were to hang somebody on a cross and they were supposed to die, and that person didn't die, it would be their own necks at stake, right? It was their profession. They were professional killers. So it's kind of an insult to Roman soldiers to say that somehow Jesus survived all of this. But let's just say that he did survive it. A half-dead man could not have passed as the conqueror of death after coming down off the cross. I mean, with everything that Jesus endured, not just nails into his wrists and into his feet and a crown of thorns on his head, after all of the flogging that he had endured, in any way could have possibly passed off to his disciples, hello, look, I have resurrected from the dead, and them claim like he's come back to life. Does that make sense? There's just no way you could pass for the conqueror of death if you had only lost consciousness and regained it later. Finally, the concept of the bodily resurrection of Jesus was a new concept to a Jewish audience, even though Saul of Tarsus, who later became Paul, spent most of his time, much of his time talking to Jewish audiences and showing them how their scriptures had pointed to the bodily resurrection of the Messiah. That was still a new concept. To Jews, they believed that the resurrection would take place at the end of time. There would be one resurrection. And so this was a new concept to them, meaning if Jesus' disciples, who were Jewish, saw him having, they thought lost consciousness and regained it, they would have thought, oh, he's still alive, not, oh, wow, he came back from the dead. Does that make sense? Well, so much so did they believe that they themselves were willing to die for this belief. They themselves were so convicted that Jesus himself had died, had been buried, and then had been resurrected, that they themselves were willing to die for this belief. And the last thing I would just say is there's really no evidence in the historical record or otherwise that Jesus faked his own death. The bottom line is that the evidence of Jesus' death by crucifixion is cumulative and it's unchallenged. No serious scholars question the death of Jesus. Jesus died. The real question is, why did Jesus die? And I talked about that in episode 7. If you haven't seen that, go check out episode 7. And after watching it, if you still have a question, you can go to investigatejesus.com and submit a question kind of for follow-up, and I'd love to address that. But the primary follow-up question is, if Jesus actually died and he was buried, how do we know that the tomb was actually empty? How can we be confident of that? In fact, how can we ever be sure that Jesus was ever laid in a tomb to begin with? It's a great question, and we're going to talk about that in the next video.